Welcome to the 2008 Public Forum briefing on the September resolution resolved that the United States should implement a military draft. We're going to look at the history of conscription, judicial considerations, topic overview, considerations for today, history of the current resolution, philosophical considerations, political considerations, social considerations, and then finally end with pro and con strategies. History of conscription starts in the Revolutionary War. It should be noted, however, that only states had the power to draft soldiers, not the federal government. The power to draft for the federal government to draft soldiers was done in the Civil War, which caused massive protests and riots in the North and the South. In World War I, the federal government again drafted soldiers, and as well as suppressed civil rights of those who complained or criticized the draft system. In World War II, we see the modern lottery system, where you also have considerations for non-combatants who were given jobs as medics in non-violent positions, but certainly prone to danger. In the Cold War, we had a situation of military readiness, but the drafting was very small, except for the Korean conflict. In the Vietnam War, 1963 to 74, we see 8.7 million served in this military, but only 3.5 million were actually found in Vietnam. Of the total number, 1/4 were drafted. The rest volunteered. People volunteered so they could get better positions in the military, in the Navy or the Air Force, where there was less threat. It is estimated that for every one draftee, 3 to 4 were scared into volunteering, at least by General Hershey, the commander, the officer in charge of the Selective Service Administration. In 1974 to 80, we see the beginning of the all-volunteer force. There were increased pay and benefits that came with military service at this time in order to attract people. We still see increased pay and benefits, but in 1980 we see the start of the Selective Service. The Selective Service Act requires that all males 18 or older register at the post office to be possibly drafted. It should be noted that in 1980 the Selective Service Act required that if you did not register, you could face up to 5 years imprisonment, a $250,000 fine. Although most of this was not done, what the primary impact of selective service is, you cannot get a federal job if you do not register, nor can you apply for any type of student loans or grants. When we look at the judicial history of the draft in the United States, we see in 1918, Arver versus the United States questioned the legitimacy of the draft. This was the draft was upheld by the Supreme Court on the basis of the responsibilities of the citizens. In 1968, we see the same argument made in the United States versus Holmes, yet the draft was upheld. However, one justice pointed out that the declaration of war had not been done, and perhaps that was the issue that the Supreme Court should address. The Supreme Court did not, however, address that. In 1981, after the Selective Service Act, Roscoe versus Goldberg argued that the Selective Service Act violated the Fifth Amendment Due Process Clause, since men and not women were subject to the draft. The Supreme Court upheld the Selective Service Act, arguing that military need was greater than the need for equity. However, if this were to be revisited now, it is a question whether or not the court would have voted that way. When we look at the topic, we have to realize that it's U.S. specific in the United States, but studies in other countries would be useful. South Korea, Israel, Switzerland all have selective service, mandatory military service. Implement. Now, this means it is not the current system of selective service, but a new thing, a new action. Remember, people are generally conservative. Even liberal people are conservative. No one likes new things. Therefore, the burden on the affirmative is to show, or the pro is to show, that adoption of this new thing, this new draft, would be beneficial. Military draft is a slippery term. The traditional view is the violent conflict The purpose of the military is violent conflict. However, the new view, as supported by the Department of Defense Secretary, is nation-building and humanitarian service. So these definitions will determine the course of the debate. When we look at considerations for today, we have to realize that Iraq is an unpopular peace. The Democratic midterm games in 2006 and the low presidential and congressional approval ratings, though the economy could be to blame, it's primarily due to the morass that we find ourselves in. Americans don't like a long-term war. There's a 29% approval rating for Iraq right now. A new campaign ads by the military found in movie theaters on emphasis on demanning the front lines. But the future of warfare has changed. Long-term wars and smaller conflicts are a reality in the post-Cold War era. The need to prosecute less global military actions on a sustained scale are more likely. The push-button war and the quick battlefields are less and less likely as we look at wars in the future. The history of the current resolution really needs to be considered, and we're going to end the first part with this. Current proponents of the draft are mostly opponents of the Iraq War. Now, there are a few generals and a few, there was the head of the Veterans Administration who suggested the draft would be good, but he's since recanted that position rather quickly. Rather, the current proponents of the draft are mostly the opponents of the Iraq War. They believe that the draft will crystallize resistance to an unpopular war. Currently, 29% of Americans, roughly, believe that the Iraq War is going well. Yet there are no wide-scale protests. This is roughly the same statistic that was found in Vietnam. Yet we see no college protests, no violence, no burning of Selective Service Administration cards. Why? Well, because the people are somewhat lulled into the concept that the troops are secondary, that they aren't really involved. So therefore, if we had the draft, people, the proponents of the draft, would believe that people would start to become more and more against the Iraq War, wanting to take us back to the protests in the Vietnam era. This is found in the Democrat from New York, Charlie Rangel. In 2003, sponsored a bill for a universal draft. The GOP majority, through parliamentary procedure, defeated that proposition 402-2. In 2006, he again called for the draft. Speaker Pelosi, attempting to maintain equilibrium in the House, rejected that debate. And then finally in 2007, there's the Universal National Service Act, H.R. 393, that has not yet been passed. It's not been up for debate, and it's not scheduled for debate. It calls for no deferments. Men and women ages 18 to 42. No college deferment. No deferment after age 20, including marriage and children. Now, for those eager beavers out there, find Charlie Rangel and what he said about this bill. If this bill is going to be just a showboat, if it's going to just be a political grandstanding, then what you really have to look at is that Charlie Rangel's bill does not apply. If Charlie Rangel's bill does apply, you could certainly use this for pro-ground. For con-ground, arguing that deferments would create an unequal playing field, clearly you could argue that Charlie Rangel's bill does not apply. That's the end of the first part of the briefing. We'll be talking about considerations and strategies in the next part.